In today's video, I'm going to show you some techniques for cross-hatching. So we're going to start with this basic example of an arm, add some different rendering effects, and talk about how we can really get those forms to look more dimensional. So without further ado, let's jump in and do some cross-hatching. Okay, so I want to talk to you about rendering, and I got a couple muscly arms here for you. So obviously the same arm, I just copied it. But I wanted to have there be some kind of basis of shadow here. Just quick FYI on the shadows is I typically will draw out a shape. So say this is the shoulder. I will draw out a shape that, kind of makes it look more spherical, but I'll purposely kind of zigzag a little bit back and forth. And then a lot of times I'll add little pieces to it. So I don't know if you can see that based on the way I've shadowed. I guess you can see it right there. So I'll add pieces to it. The reason being is that usually my first attempt, I'll do something that looks too spherical, and then I need to mess it up a bit, make it a little bit more organic, or I don't know, just inconsistent. Really, I just feel like if you go around this, the bicep is a perfect example. It's almost too plain right there. So I might come in here and add like another little bump here, bump over there. I tend to find that looks a little bit more realistic for shadows. So anyways, I just wanted to give you an explanation of why that looks the way that it does. So let's get into the rendering, because that's the main purpose of today's video. And so with the rendering, I do a couple things really. One, I'll usually turn the artwork to where it feels the best for me to pull the line stroke. I like to taper the lines. So when I first started rendering like this, I did a lot more of this. And these lines are a little tapered, but I would kind of make them a bit too consistent and too far apart from one another. So something like this. And this doesn't hurt. There's rendering styles where this comes in handy. It kind of, to me, it almost looks like what you would see a little bit more in like a old school illustration. And then with cross-hatching it, you could do something like that. And you see it starts to give that gradation. And it's not bad, and it's actually really fast, which is the greatest thing about this particular method. But it's not really the style I like to do. But actually, let me do one more thing. But keep in mind that if you go back and forth a few times, you're going to keep getting a darker and darker gradient, and you can also separate these lines as they get further away from the part you're trying to show gradation and a color shift. So essentially what I'm trying to do is just break up the black to white ratio, this solid edge basically, especially when it's inked. It needs that kind of gradation to fade. So what I like to do here is taper the lines a bit more heavily and then blend them off to a sharper point. Now, the only thing to watch out for with this method, I think anyways, is that you can get caught up in really focusing on making these tapered lines, and you can kind of ignore the direction you're taking a little bit easier. Or at least I can. I guess it depends on how well you can concentrate, I guess. But essentially what I'm trying to say there is that maybe you start off and you want this effect that your lines, they're thick here and they taper a little bit right past there, right? So you're trying to envision that, but as you maneuver around this, like I said, you're kind of focused on tapering these lines. It can get a bit distracting from where that gradation is going to occur. So you got to kind of juggle a little bit here mentally as you're doing this. But I typically will just go into it with a general idea of how far I want this fade to occur up the. In this case, this is the medial head of the deltoid, something like that. And as I get up here, I just kind of blend it off. And then I want to start bringing these down smaller because I'm starting to get to the light source side. So something like that. Yeah, and that's about it. Now, some people might tell you, well, you should really bring these this way, because that's really the direction the muscle's taking, right? So if you were to think about this with your wrapping lines, wrapping lines are just kind of these imaginary lines that you place across the forms. You'd probably think of this form a little bit more like this. Okay, so that would be the dimensional way that I would think about that medial deltoid head or whatever. So my lines kind of contradict that. You could see, especially once I've implemented those, my lines are going in the wrong direction. But I am kind of thinking about just the light source at this point. And I can really fix this with cross hatching. So let's say that I implement this, and like I said, now I know that with these lines in place that I'm kind of fighting the look of the form that I'm after. Let's just bring some of these this way now. Actually, I'm pulling up on the screen, which I shouldn't, because this is usually my... it's a little bit more inconsistent for me to do it this way. So I'm going to rotate this around. See, and you can even start it just to get an idea for where it should be going. And then rotate it. That's kind of a little bit of an aid, because then I'm no longer worried about the direction the lines are taking. I've already established a starting point for the direction in which they should be going. And now I'm just focusing on that little crosshatch pattern that I see, those little diamonds. And notice too that I brought those up past those other lines by a little bit. That's part of creating that gradation. So each time you crosshatch, you can really take that a bit further. I typically will only go 3 angles and I'm good. I might do 3 angles and I might do something like this. You know, you can do these lines where they start tighter in succession this way, and as you come up across the form, you can have them space out. I kind of like that look as well, but that's just almost, I use that more like to break things up, and you know, I don't like this overly consistent rendering over the whole thing. So I feel like by adding that next row of cross hatching, I've kind of fixed that that area of the form that wasn't looking right. So I'm going to do this again. Again, I want to kind of play around with the idea that this comes past the other lines. I think that'll introduce another fade that I want to see in there. And I'm actually looking at the diamonds that I'm creating as I'm doing that cross hatching. So that's kind of something for me to focus upon so I don't get too distracted. So there's that. And then let's say, oh, we'd want to add them here as well, but maybe a lot less. So I'm not going to go too far into this area because, again, we got to think about that light source side. Another way too is you can break up these pointed lines with a little bit of hatching. I think that always kind of softens up the forms. And so let's work on this tricep a little bit. And so I want to keep some consistency in the way that I make the lines. But I don't want there to be like, I don't want that to be my only goal. Like I said, to me, I'm really looking at it like it's a fade, not like there has to be this unified design all throughout. But it is a good idea to practice that. One thing I will say is that I feel that when you hatch like this, especially if you don't taper the lines, right? So you have this consistent kind of mark making. Let me see if I can make it a little more consistent. Kind of like this. All the way around. And you do the same thing all the way around, all the way around. And it's the same height. And by height, I mean the distance away from the shadow to where it stops, like this abruptness. If it's that same consistency all the way around, so let me erase this back to show you what I mean. Kind of like this. Then I think it actually hurts more than helps. I think that you'd be better off with no rendering. So it starts to flatten it out. So we have to think about these forms being, all different heights and thicknesses, and they're massive forms, right? And they're not all the same, size or whatever. So you kind of have to think about that as you render as well. So let me start back here, and I'm going to make it purposely heavier or taller rendering lines, basically. But as I get down to the side of this bit of the tricep, what is it, the short head of the tricep, I believe? Long head's on the inside, right? On the medial side of the arm. But anyways, I want these rendering lines to be noticeably smaller as they come down here. I think that explains the bulk of the tricep better. And then as I render the other way, and again, I really should rotate this because And I'm actually going to bring these lines down now. So they're actually shorter than the other lines. So again, there's no hard and fast rules to this. I'm looking at it more in terms of the way that I would like to see this shadowed. In fact, I almost feel like I want to see some lines coming this way now. I don't know if this will be too much, but just got to try it and see. So I'm trying to round this part of the tricep. Yeah, I kind of like that. I don't like this shape right here now. I'm starting to think that the overall shape of the tricep in correlation to this part of the middle of the arm is a bit off. But anyways, I don't want to get into fixing this art too much. I think that rendering helps it a little bit. So I'm going to work over here to the bicep, same thing. I'm going to bring these lines up and around. But again, I would really recommend that you play with different thicknesses of taper to the start, because you got to remember, like if I pull in real tight here, the more I bring this together like this, the more it kind of looks like a transition of light to dark is a gradient. But the more there's these gaps in between there, the less that works. Or it'll still work, but it's just not as smooth of a transition, I think. So there's lots of opportunity for style there, right? There's all sorts of neat things you can do to this area of the work, but you can also convey that with cross hatching. And again, with the cross hatching, you want to really play around with the different patterns that you see in the hatching portion of it. So there we go, get that rounded a bit. And you don't always have to cross hatch every area. Some can just be tapered lines. There's all sorts of things you can do. And so let's do this part. Just trying to round this a bit with the forms. Obviously, it'd be a lot easier just to show very pointed lines or very straight lines, but I'm trying to round those at least a little bit. You know, they're still a bit straight, because you can see the straighter they are, they start to look like teeth on a comb, and they start to flatten out the form. So I don't want that. Obviously, I want this to look more curved and rounded. And that's really another reason why I do better with rotating like this, because I can use I'm left-handed, and as I'm pulling against the screen here, I can use that natural curvature of my, the way that my wrist pulls. As I pull the pencil or stylus downward, I can get that curve in there a lot easier. Sometimes just getting things to go with the natural mechanics of your hand. I can still go back and thicken these up a little bit. Yeah, not bad. It's a little messy right there, but again, this is really the process I take, and you just want to play around with all different variations of this. You want to say, well, what if I cross-hatched, or I added some lines over here, and I created another tone, and then I went back and maybe just added these little darker spots at the base here. You just want to play around with these concepts. There's a lot of ways you could look at this, but ultimately, you're trying to perceive these areas as different forms, whether you're thinking of them spherically, cylindrically. I tend to think of them a little bit like forms that are flowing in and around and through one another, more than I tend to just think about spheres and cylinders. Because again, if not, you can sort of overly define that. And see, even with the shoulder here, if you notice, even after this rendering, it still came back and started to look too spherical. This medial head to the shoulder right there is way too spherical. So that's where you can really kind of push these shadow shapes further and then render across that and really play around with those. An artist that comes to mind that does some really neat shadow shapes in a way that looks very organic or just interesting, I guess, would be Ivan Reis. I hope I'm saying that right. It's like, I'll make sure to link in the description box below. I love the way he does shadows in a way where It's got kind of this bumpiness, this organic nature, but looks really well done. And I don't know, it's got a certain amount of realism, but obviously it looks great for a comic book style. But just keep playing around with these rendering techniques. Try to do different line variations, different widths of the taper, thicknesses of the taper, different orientations in the way that you pull the lines, the spacing, the cross hatching, all that fun stuff. And you'll eventually find your rhyme and reason for all this. So I would love to know what you think of today's video, as well as what you'd like to see in the future. So make sure to comment in the description box below, and I really appreciate you watching. So as always, keep drawing, keep having fun, and bye for now.